Hi guys, welcome to my channel, Amie Howard Art. I'm Amie and today I have a tutorial video for you. So today's tutorial we're going to be looking at how to draw this realistic tiger. So I'm going to talk you through the steps which I've taken to be able to draw this realistic drawing. So one of the first things which I have done before I've gone through with any colour and done anything to the drawing is made sure that I have a completely accurate outline, and this is really important to bear in mind if you want to be able to draw realistically. So you want to make sure that you map out the actual outline, so the shapes of all of the features and the important areas of the tiger, so the ears, the eyes, the nose, the open mouth, but you also want to map out all of the different tonal changes. So you want to map out where you've got some light and where you've got some dark areas. So what I've done is mapped out the stripes, because those are the dark areas and the bits in between the stripes are the lighter areas, and I've also mapped out where I've got some of those colour changes, so where the white kind of fades into the orange. I've just mapped those out and then I've applied that line drawing to my drawing paper. So once I've got that accurate outline, then I can go in and start with the coloured part. And the first thing which I start with is the eyes, and I first of all start off just by gently erasing the graphite, and then I like to just gently outline all of the dark areas around the eye with a dark sepia pencil. And I prefer to use dark sepia over black because then you can introduce other colours and you get a real sense of depth. So I go in with a really sharp dark sepia pencil and I'm just layering really lightly. And that's really essential when you are using coloured pencils, that you do go in really lightly and build in lots of layers, rather than going in with hard pressure to begin with. If you go in with lighter layers, then it's much easier to erase your mistakes than if you go in with really hard pressure. So once I've got that dark outline of the eye and all of those dark features in place, then I go in and start to add the iris, so the coloured part to the eye. And to begin with, I start with my really light layers, so I add some cream and then I slowly build up to the darker colours. So I'm building in some oranges and then I build up to the really dark greens which are featured around the pupil. So one thing which I have done differently in this portrait to what I usually do is, instead of burnishing with the coloured pencils and applying pressure to blend my coloured pencils, I'm actually using a solvent for this one. And if you would like to learn how to use solvent and the different techniques and how to apply it, then I have done a separate tutorial on that which I will link up above and in the description for you. So once I've added all of those dark areas and that coloured part to the eye, then I have gone through and blended with the solvent, and the solvent which I like to use is the Zest-It pencil blend. Once that's blended out, I have to obviously wait for it to dry before I can add more layers of coloured pencil. So whilst I'm waiting for that to dry, I just start to add all of the surrounding areas to the portrait. So I'm starting to add the fur around the eye, and what I'm doing is starting off with my really light colours and then slowly building up. So I'm starting off with a buff titanium Caran d'Ache luminance pencil, and all I'm doing is making sure it's really sharp and just layering in the direction that the fur is going in. So I'm really paying attention and focusing on my reference photo, really sort of mapping in my mind which direction all of that fur is going in, and then applying that to my pencil on my paper and making sure that I use really light pressure and just build the layers really softly. Once I've got that initial base layer of the buff titanium down, then I like to go in and just map out any of the dark parts. So I'm mapping in all of the really prominent stripes and just really going in really lightly with the dark sepia pencil and just mapping out the shapes. So again, I'm using a really light pressure, making sure the pencil is really nice and sharp, and paying real close attention to that reference photo and really noting the shape that the stripes are making. And then I'm applying that to my pencil, just lightly shading back and forth, just really lightly applying that layer to really map in those stripes and those darker areas. Once I've mapped in all of those dark stripes, then I can go through and start to add my mid-tones. So I start to work from my lightest colours up to my darkest colours once more. So on the orange areas, I'm applying some burnt ochres, some terracottas and some sanguine colours, eventually working my way up to burnt sienna and some walnut brown in the darkest areas. And in the white area areas, I don't just leave those with the base layer. Those are actually made up of a lot of layers of French grey 10% and warm grey 3 from the Polychromos, and I've also added some Delft blue in some of those white areas as well, just to give it a little hint of contrast and to really make those white areas pop. So once I have worked on a particular section, then I go through and blend with the Zest It. And then once I've blended and I'm waiting for that to dry before I can add more layers of colour pencil, then I'm going through and just adding all of the other areas of the tiger. So I'm just working my way up the face and then working my way across to the ears. And the ears are rendered in exactly the same way as the rest of it. So I'm very first putting down my base layer of some buff titanium, really taking note of any fur direction changes, really taking note of the length of the fur as well, and then applying the appropriate pencil strokes to the paper. So where the fur gets a little bit longer around the ears, I'm elongating my shading strokes a little bit. Once I've got that base layer down on the ear, then I'm going around and just fleshing out all of those dark areas. So I'm adding that really dark outer rim of the ear and that really dark shadow within the ear as well. And where you've got some of those straggly hairs within the ear, some of those really sort of prominent ones, all I'm doing is just creating some fur lines with my pencil and just wiggling the pencil around just to sort of mimic that texture. So these aren't particularly straight lines, they are really wiggly. I'm just creating some really kind of messy lines with my really sharp dark sepia pencil. And then once I've got those dark areas mapped in, then I go in and flesh out my midtones. So again, I'm going through and adding some of those orange tones, so using that burnt ochre, that terracotta, and then fleshing out some of the white areas with some of the grey pencils as well. And then once all of that is complete, then I'm just going through and blending with that Zest It once more. So I apply exactly the same technique of putting those base layers down, adding in the dark areas and then fleshing out the midtones across the entire piece. So I'm going down through the neck. The white areas actually required a lot of shading. According to the reference photo, those areas were the darkest in terms of the white colour. So on those white areas underneath the neck, I just added multiple layers of the French grey 10% and the warm grey 3, but I also added really light shadings of the walnut brown and the burnt sienna and a little bit of that Delft blue just to really darken it up. With that neck in place, then I turned my attention back towards the face and started the right hand ear. So I just employed the exact same techniques, just using really sharp pencils, going in with really light pressure and working from my lightest colour, then going in and mapping out all of the dark parts and then going through and fleshing out those midtones. And one really important thing when you are using a solvent for blending is that you do use really light pressure. You don't need to go in and add any hard pressure because all of your blending is going to be done with that solvent. So there's really no need for you to go in with any hard pressure. So all of my layers throughout this piece were exceptionally light, barely even putting any pressure through the pencil at all. You can render this portrait without using a solvent if you don't like to use that method, and all I would do is just go through with a really opaque white pencil. So I like to use the Caran d'Ache Luminance White, and all I would do instead of using that solvent is just run that white pencil over the entire area that I want to blend out, and then I would be ready to add my coloured pencil back over the top. So working my way down the face, I then come to the nose and the mouth, and this is one of the most interesting areas. I like to focus on noses and mouths, and I like to render those because it's a complete contrast in the way of technique compared to the fur and other features. So for the nose, instead of working in the direction of any fur, because obviously there's no fur on the nose, all I do is just make really small circular motions with my coloured pencils when I'm applying the really light layers. And that just allows you to get this really nice smooth surface, which is obviously what you're going to want to achieve for a nose, for teeth and for a tongue and those kinds of features. So for the nose, I worked in exactly the same way as I've said throughout this. Just worked with really light layers, applying the light ones first, then adding in any dark features and then going through and fleshing out the midtones. The only exception for the midtones here was that I used quite a bit of the Sanguine from the Polychromos, just to get that really sort of dark orangey brown colour rather than the pure orange. Then moving on to the mouth, there was this whole dark dark area directly next to the neck where you've got a lot of shadow. So for this, all I did was just laid down some really light layers of dark sepia. So I didn't go through and add any of those really light base tones because it's not really necessary on those really dark areas. So instead I just went through straight away with the dark sepia without adding that light layer. And for the whiskers, what I did for this was actually used an embossing tool to indent the paper, and I use this method because then when you add the coloured pencil back over the top, the coloured pencil avoids those grooves and you can get some really nice crisp lines from that. One thing which I didn't do with this though is I didn't go through with any of the solvent blender, because in my experience when you use a solvent blender and you have embossed, sometimes, especially with the darker colours, the pigment and everything can move around and it can actually get into that groove of the paper. So with this bit I didn't actually blend all over with the solvent, but I blended in between some of those embossed lines, and some places I didn't even use the solvent at all. I just used multiple layers of the dark sepia pencil. So for the mouth I used a combination of some burnt carmine and some medium flesh, so some really nice dark pink colours, and the teeth, instead of them being really white, they were actually quite yellow and quite shadowed. So all I did was just built up some of those light layers, so I used some buff titanium and some brown ochre 10%, and then I actually went in with a green gold polychromos pencil and really fleshed out those really dark shadow, really kind of yellowy looking teeth on there. So once I'd finished those parts, then I just went through with the solvent blender, and then I allowed my entire drawing to dry for 18 hours. So I left it for quite a long time because I did actually blend with a fair amount of solvent, and I wanted to make sure that the solvent was completely dry before I went over with any other coloured pencil layers. So I wanted to make sure that the drawing was completely dry so that it wouldn't sort of fuzz up and mess up if I went in and it was still wet. So you can see that just through adding these first layers and then blending out, everything sort of looks really rough, and the next few layers is where it really starts to come to life. So with these next layers, all I did was just went through with the mid-tones and really darkened up those darker areas. So what I did was just started with the back of the tiger, worked from left to right, and I just added all of those nice orange colours, really hyped up that orange tone, really got a nice concentration of colour down, and I just went through with the burnt ochres, working my way up to burnt siennas and walnut browns, and adding those really dark brown colours in the darkest areas. So one thing that I wanted to make sure with this is that I didn't leave it looking too light, and that's a problem which I think a lot of people do have, is being afraid of going too dark with your piece. You really need to judge your light and your dark values, and you need to darken and lighten them appropriately. So the back half of this tiger was actually quite dark, so I made sure that I added lots of the burnt sienna and the walnut brown to the back half of this tiger. So to begin with, when adding the mid-tones, all I'm doing is just shading, just working back and forth in the direction that the fur is going in, and then as I'm building up to those darker colours, then I'm starting to add in lines. So I'm starting to add in the real detailed lines of the fur. So with the burnt sienna and the walnut brown, I'm making sure that the pencil is really nice and sharp, and then I'm just working in the direction of the fur, just making some really fine tapered lines. So all I'm doing is putting the point of the pencil on the paper and then working in the direction of the fur and gently lifting the pencil as I'm coming towards the end of that fur stroke. So it creates this really nice tapered end to the fur line. And all I'm doing is just using those dark colours to work that method over the entire area to really create that really nice fluffy texture of the tiger. So I'm just working across the back of the tiger and then coming down to do the neck and the ear, and just working in exactly the same way. So really adding those mid-tones down, so those orange tones, and then working the dark sepia and some walnut brown and even some Delft blue into the darker areas. And I like to add the walnut brown and the Delft blue into those dark areas because I feel like it gives a really nice depth to the black, rather than going in with just a pure black or a pure dark sepia pencil. I feel like adding the walnut brown and the Delft blue really make it come to life, and it really adds a nice contrast against the lighter areas and those orange areas as well. So with the whiter areas, I actually added quite a lot of walnut brown pencil lines, so creating that really nice fur texture through there. So you'll notice that a lot of my white areas as I said, aren't white. They are made up of a lot of grey tones and a lot of the brown tones actually. So the white areas, although they look quite white in comparison to the dark areas, they are actually made up of quite a lot of the dark colours. So all I've done for those white areas is just used really light pressure and just added some of those fur lines, created that really nice fluffy texture, especially on the neck there. Just added those dark fur lines through the fur. So as I've worked around the neck, I've really started to tone those white areas. I've added a little bit of the olive green yellowish, which we added to the eyes. I've added some olive brown 50% from the luminance, just adding some green tones in there for a little bit of colour differentiation, and just really paying attention to the reference photo, noting if there are any shadows and any light areas, and just adding the correct and appropriate tones in the right places. So coming along the face of the tiger, I've just done exactly the same thing, just worked back through with those orange, so those burnt ochres and terracottas, just really added another layer and depth to the dark areas with the dark sepias, the delft blue and the walnut brown, just really layering from the lightest colours to the darkest colours and just working in that way, just adding another layer of coloured pencil to what we have previously done. So I'm just doing that over the entire piece, and then once that layer is finished, then I go through and blend. And on this layer, I'm not necessarily blending all over. All I'm doing is just using the solvent blender to blend in the areas where I want to add some areas of highlight. So I blend in these areas because I want to add some white pencil and some really defined lines back over the top. So I'm just looking at the reference photo and blending in the areas where I can see those areas of detail where you've got some really white overlapped hairs, and I'm just blending in those areas because using that solvent blender is just going to break down that binder and move the pigment around into the tooth of the paper, so it's going to be a lot easier to add the colour pencil back over in those areas. So I'm just picking out certain areas and just blending with the solvent in those areas. And then again, once I've finished blending, then I just wait for it to dry, just waiting for it to be completely bone dry, and then I'm going through and adding that extra layer of detail. So with this layer, I'm not adding in any of the mid-tones. All I'm doing is going through with the Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil and some dark sepia pencils and just really adding in some really fine details. So with the Luminance white pencil, when I'm adding these details, I'm looking at the reference photo, noticing where there's any sort of light shining on the tiger's face, and then focusing the pencil in those areas. So this is mainly within the left hand ear. You've got a few really white straggly hairlines through there. So all I'm doing is using exactly the same technique as when we very first went in with our first layers, and that is using some really straggly, really wavy fur lines to really convey that texture. And I'm pushing quite hard with the Luminance pencil at this point just to really get down that pigment of the white. And it doesn't really matter if I do go through with a hard pressure here, because I know that I'm not going to need to add any layers of coloured pencil over the top, so I can use that heavy pressure where I know that I'm not going to add any further layers. So I'm just applying that same technique and that rule across the rest of the piece, just really adding in some really nice fine white hairs to the white areas of the neck and really overlapping onto the dark stripes of the tiger as well. And then I'm just working my way through the face, just really paying attention to that reference photo as to where these lighter areas are, and then just applying that white pencil, making sure that that pencil is really nice and sharp, because that's going to enable us to get that really nice fine pigment down. And then I'm going through in one or two areas and just focusing a few more of the dark sepia, so picking out some of those areas of detail and just adding those in as well. Once I've picked out those areas of detail with that white pencil and the dark sepia, then I've gone through and just picked out some of the whisker lines. So some of them have become a little bit cloudy and a little bit muddy with some of the dark sepia pigment. So all I've done is just used a really sharp white pencil and really worked into the grooves and really kind of tried to lighten them as much as possible. In some areas it wasn't possible to pick those out with the white pencil, so I have gone through at the very end with a white gel pen and just added those in so they're really nice and white and have a really nice contrast compared to that dark area where they're sitting over the mouth. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope that the tips that I have given you and sort of talked through my process, I really hope that this can help with your future realistic drawings. And if you decide to have a go at this tutorial, make sure that you tag me on your social media. So make sure you tag me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, any of those ones which you use. I'd love to see the outcome of your drawings from following this tutorial. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you've liked this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up. It really does help. And if you are new around here and you like this tutorial and you want to see more, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon as well. And there are some more videos which I think you are going to enjoy just over there. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!